everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas Muris. This podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org, and I want to let you know that Catholic Culture is in the middle of its fall fundraising campaign. Well, not in the middle. We really just started. In order to keep our operation going, this CatholicCulture.org is a lot more than just this one podcast. We have news, commentary, 3 other podcasts besides this one, a lot of great written commentary going on these days, and we also just hired a tech person, so we need to raise funds to pay his salary. Please go to CatholicCulture.org/donate. And we will very much be grateful for that. I pray for all of my listeners and our donors every day. My guest today wrote an excellent essay about a year ago in New Polity magazine called The Case for Just Sex Discrimination. So we're going to be talking about the issue of mothers working outside the home, but in particular in relation to anti-discrimination law, workplace policies, things like that, but also with regards to the church's broader teaching on this topic and, anthropology with regard to women and men and their relationship to the home, their relationship to work. Obviously a very controversial topic, but I encourage you to listen in because my guest, Margaret Harper McCarthy, does an excellent job threading this needle. We got to know each other earlier this year. There had been a Wall Street Journal article advocating a kind of Catholic feminism, and Margaret and I both separately wrote responses to it. She wrote a letter that appeared in the journal, and I wrote a series of articles on CatholicCulture.org, sort of critiquing this piece. And then we started corresponding by email. We've exchanged a lot of emails and been wanting to do a podcast together for quite a while now. So I'm really happy to have her here. She is Associate Professor of Theological Anthropology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family. And again, she's the author of this New Polity essay, The Case for Just Sex Discrimination. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor. I must say that title is obviously provocative and meant to be.
All right, so why don't we just get right into this? What you were writing about in this essay, and I guess the way I would describe the position you're responding to in a broad sense is that there's people out there in the kind of the conservative and the Catholic world who are advocating for a certain kind of workplace policies that at first glance appear to respect the differences between men and women, but ultimately, if you look closer, it's in order to treat them as kind of interchangeable on a higher level. In other words, we're going to treat men and women differently in workplace policy, but in a way that enables them to have an equal place in the workplace and thus sort of treat them as interchangeable in relation to work and in relation to their families. Would you say that's an accurate kind of description?
Yes, I do. In fact, anti-discrimination law treats pregnancy as a disability that can be overcome quickly. So just as employers are to guarantee a place for those who've injured themselves, have a short-term disability, pregnancy law has been fitted into that. And so the idea of the anti-discrimination law pertaining to employment, which guarantees certain, leaves for injury, but also leaves for pregnancy, are the ones are meant to get the new mother back in the saddle as quickly as possible. I liken it to a handicap in sports. So you acknowledge that there's a difference. This player of this golfer. Is handicapped in some way. We're going to give him a leg up so he can sort of stay in the game.
Right.
Yeah. So it's said to be a kind of appreciation of sex differences, but in the manner of sort of treating it like a handicap. There's a kind of disproportionate burden that the person has because of, in the case of the woman, she has the burden of being pregnant. She has certain burdens in the first months of the life of the child. So let's give her this sort of handicap so that she can be an equal player, very soon thereafter.
Right.
That's just the way the law is absolutely written. In fact, in the recent legislation, what is it called? the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act, the employer is enjoined not to even require the woman to take leave. So there's to be no view at all expressed whether or not to take it or not. So leave isn't even considered necessarily a good thing.
So these policies were, sort of put into place in the mid 20th century, I guess, sometimes lumped into the 1964 Anti-Discrimination Act, because what was originally going to be about race, sex was added in there. And it was pretty sort of explicitly kind of a feminist thing of we're going to treat the sexes exactly the same. And now, can you give us a bit of a background on how this has kind of flipped in certain circles, where now people in our world are kind of advocating this, but sort of reframing it as an appreciation of sex difference? Can you give a little bit more background on this discussion that you're intervening in with this article?
Yes. So, the current argument is this would be pro-life, because it would remove one of the incentives for abortion. So there's a conflict that women have between being mothers and, pursuing their careers with equal amount of intensity and professionalism. And so if you remove that problem, then they'll have children. So the idea is this is sort of this external prohibition on having children, either having them or keeping them. And if we just sort of tweak things in the workplace and remove the external impediments, then women will have, they won't have abortions, or in this case, now that we're talking about the demographic winter, they will have children. And this is being very clearly shown not to be the case. Now that we have the demographic winter upon us, in countries, in the Scandinavian countries where you have the most what are called pro-women policies, which are supposed to be the most pro-natal, in fact, the demographic winter is more upon them. In fact, it seems that the cheaper daycare is, the fewer children women have, because the idea is it habituates women to a kind of lifestyle that makes motherhood less and less feasible and desirable. And I think that's because women are, they're smart about this. They understand that notwithstanding all of the policies, the allowances, the breaks, the leaves, even tax incentives, there's what is called an opportunity cost. When a woman has a child, it binds her in a very particular way, and for life. And I think women rightly see that. And so
I remember reading in Thomas Sowell years ago that statistically, when men have children, they work more, and when women have children, they work less, and that's just kind of how the tendencies of the sexes.
Absolutely true. So the women who want children, who've decided in advance, what they value most is to be mothers. What they want actually typically is part-time work. They're the ones who lean out. But if you put first, the you can have it all idea, and you so put your career first, which our whole system is geared towards, that pretty much will rule out having children. That's Helen Andrews, who's become kind of famous recently for her article on the Great Feminization. She wrote an article a couple of years ago called "Lean Out," and she makes that case, I think, quite well. Girls have been raised in what's called the Girl Project since the 1980s, and the whole point of the Girl Project is to sort of root out their sort of natural romantic desires. Make them think it's weird to get married right out of college, and to sort of teach them to get their ducks in a row before they marry, which should be around 28 or 30. Now I hear it's 30. but what that does is habituates patterns of the heart, to a lifestyle that then it makes marriage difficult to come by. It makes fertility difficult to come by, and then for the one who does get lucky enough to get married, one can see pretty quickly that having a child, is an opportunity cost. And one might have to then make sacrifice what one hasn't been prepared for her entire life.
Right. I mean, another pattern of the heart it kind of inculcates is this idea that dependence is a bad thing, that depending on a husband's income is a bad thing. Because what if you want to leave him, and then, that kind of thing. And so
absolutely, that's the whole point of you're starting with you can have it all. You start with that. You start with training girls to think first of professions. And by the way, we're talking about professions, high level, high intensity profession. This is not the kind of discussion that those among the poor are having. These are discussions among those whose children are going to college and who sort of value sort of white collar professional careers as chiefly valuable. So we're talking about careers that have a kind of intensity to them and single-mindedness.
Right. And just going back to policy, I mean, an example occurs to me of these supposedly pro-family policies that actually undermine the structure of the family. So I think Hungary a year ago or so announced a policy that would, if I remember, eliminate the income tax for working mothers who had 2 or more children or something like that. So this is not reducing taxes for fathers. This is, you only get this tax. Now, they may have already had a policy that affected fathers. I don't know. But just looking at this kind of policy in isolation, it encourages women to be the one who are working, obviously, because they're the ones who are getting the tax break if they work and have more children.
Oh, that's interesting.
Whereas as we'll get into later on, when the Catholic social teaching, really from Leo XIII up through John Paul II, the last person to sort of talk about this explicitly that I know about, all say the family, when they talk about a family wage or a living wage, it is owed to the head of the family. And we can get into
absolutely.
that magisterial stuff more later, but it's just an interesting contrast. Now,
I mean, it's worth speaking a little bit about, the history of the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, please, because I don't know anything about this.
Mind. I mean, I was just with a group of lawyers on Saturday, very high level lawyers, and some of them were not aware of the history of how the word sex got added to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And so you had, that act was not passing. It was not passing, and then a congressman from Virginia, Dixiecrat, named Smith, rose up and suggested that sex be added to, race, color, national origin, and religion, and everyone laughed, and for different reasons for laughing. Some of the other Dixiecrats made very disparaging remarks about women, saying, white women should be able to work just like colored women, and Northern and Western Democrats immediately rose up against it, and as did the Association of American University Women, as did the Women's Bureau in the Labor Department, and they said this is not the kind of difference that can be homogenized in the way race, color, national origin can be.
Right.
And,
so so just to be clear for the audience, they rose up against this adding sex to the list of things that's illegal to discriminate.
Absolutely, they rose up against it, and just to give background, especially these women in the Association of American University Women and in the Women's Bureau of the Labor Department, they were from the older what's called the maternalist line. It was the maternalists are called maternalists by historians. They were social reformers that came out of the settlement movement at Madison University. They were helping immigrants to settle. Most of these were Lutherans from Lutheran stock. They were concerned about the poor that were being crowded in urban areas. They were worried about the deleterious effects of industrialism. They were teaching arts and crafts. They were teaching the arts of homemaking, which was so craft. They were interested in sort of teaching craft knowledge that was quickly being lost. And at the center of their concern was that mothers were going to be assimilated into industrial labor force, as well as children. And so they were very much working in favor of policies and legislation, labor reform, essentially, to protect mothers and children from being absorbed into the workforce. When in FDR's administration, they were Eleanor Roosevelt was one of these maternalists, and so many of these women sort of took positions in the administration. The most important one is Frances Perkins. She's kind of a name that people can recognize. One of the first women in a cabinet position. These women were they were not wilting flowers. They were intelligent intellectuals. They were mostly spinsters, if I'm not mistaken, and brought about many reforms, such as the establishment of a children's bureau, a women's bureau in the labor department, Mother's Day. Before when the First World War broke out, they made sure that women got a half of their husbands' pensions if their husbands were soldiers. They fought for mothers' pensions in the case of women becoming widows. So absolutely what they ruled out is that a woman should not be separated from her young children. And by young, they meant up to 16. So yeah, they were for a father's wage, essentially. And therefore they would have been in favor of a kind of informal system of promoting men who were fathers in fields of employment. Now, when in 1964, when Smith proposed the amendment of sex to the Civil Rights Act, who should come forward but a group of women who had been in hibernation for decades from the National Women's Party that had been established around 1910 or something like that by Alice Paul. The maternalists had been at loggerheads with these equity feminists, especially over labor legislation. Equity feminists were in bed with the industrialists, and they fought labor legislation tooth and nail. So the women from that sort of that world came forward and joined with the Dixiecrats, and that's how we got the amendment of sex to the Civil Rights Act. That's how. And so, I mean, it's kind of incredible to imagine sort of trying to embrace the system of anti-sex discrimination legislation as appreciating sex differences. I think it's the very opposite. It only appreciates in the sense that I mentioned formerly, is that it gives it a kind of handicap. So that's the history. And after that, the EEOC, the Employment Opportunity Commission, is set up in 1970 and struck all of the labor reforms that had sort of been dominant for about 50 or so years, so that now it was considered discriminatory, to take into account whether or not a woman has young children at home. There are all kinds of Supreme Court cases that basically considered as discriminatory practices that would have been considered, pro-family, pro-mother, pro-child. An employer, for example, who decides to hire an older woman who's already raised her children, and who can maybe take advantage free tuition for her college-age kids at the university over young married pro-life women, because this will be a problem at many, many levels, not only for her and for her child, but also for the office. That would all be considered discriminatory. Obviously, a family wage would be discriminatory. Obviously, practices that would, promotion practices that would prefer married men, or for that matter, married, men with a certain number of children, that would be considered discriminatory. And I argue, my point is that the current anti-sex discrimination regime we're living in is discriminatory, is unjustly discriminatory. It favors the abstract woman, man, child, employer.
It favors 50-50 participation in an abstract way.
It favors the abstraction for real men, real women, real children, real homes, and real work. That's what I would say. So
So why don't you go through those one by one, then?
Yeah, so women. Girls have been put through the Girl Project for decades now. The only thing they know is that, but there are a lot of unhappy young women, who, the marriagelessness rates are unbelievable right now. The statistics are very bad. There's a cause for that. And if you've been raised with the idea that, you're supposed to be in school until 24, 25, 26, and then you're supposed to start your internship, and then you're supposed to do your postdoc, you're on the gerbil wheel for a long time, and you have a big sign, you're wearing a big sign basically saying don't, not available for the next 10 or 15 years, right at the time when, you're marriageable and you're fertile. So there's that. So there's a kind of a prejudice for an abstract girl who's supposed to be sort of running along relentlessly on this one valuable path towards the one politically correct goal of giving us the right statistics, run along by the conoscenti who know better, even if in the depths of a young woman's heart, she might be relieved to have another possibility. So it discriminates against real women. I'm worried about, when you have an anti-sex discrimination regime like we do, and HR departments in every institution that are meant to guarantee it and protect institutions from lawsuits, there's an inducement to hire women over men, and often underranked women over higher ranked men. We just know this is true. And that in turn also discriminates women again unjustly, in my view, because a woman who snags a high-ranking job, she'll always be thought of as getting that job because of because of these policies, not because she's worthy of the job. So that means a lot of men who are going to be the ones more likely to provide for their families are underemployed, and the women who might like to lean out are overemployed. And so that, I think that's discriminatory against fathers.
Not to mention, but the greater participation of women in the workforce has depressed wages, as I understand, over the decades.
No, that's interesting. Tell me about that.
There's more supply in relation to the demand for laborers. In other words, there's more people coming into the workforce. So the fact that, wives and husbands are both working, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy when people say it's necessary for both to work to support their family, because the system in which more people are working actually creates the lower wages, and it reduces any justifiable request for a family wage, because if the wife and husband are both working, the husband can't ask for a wage that can support his whole family because he's not the only one who's working.
Yeah.
And so it actually creates the situation in which now, because they both sort of are encouraged to work, now they both have to work more often in order to support their family on two separate wages.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and of course there's so many things you have to pay for when both people are sort of careening ahead on very high level, in a very high level, intense way. It discriminates against real children. It discriminates in favor of the real bothersome child who wants his or her mother, and not an interchangeable adult who's being paid to take care of him or her. It discriminates against him in favor of this in favor of the convenient child who's now being deposited at the Child Development Center. I think you could also say, there are some workplaces and some places of human endeavor which are also discriminated against because of the kind of constant turnover that would be required, in the case of women taking leave. I mean, I want to say something about women in work later in a minute, but I mean, not every place of work is the kind of place that can tolerate or do well with a lot of sort of pregnancy leaves. Not every form of work and of human endeavor can.
The work has its objective demands, and we're not just all doing it for fun and to make money. Like, there are actual things that need to get done for society to function.
Need to get done. Yeah, back to the example I was given before. I mean, even an office, where in a Catholic institution where you have a lot of pro-life young women who would like a job. I mean, they are getting pregnant. But there's this constant turnover and constant absenteeism, and the baby comes back in the car seat and that doesn't work, and then she has to go home. Can I work on Zoom? That doesn't work very well, and I have to ask myself, well, why wouldn't it be reasonable for an employer to say, well, let's hire a woman who's finished raising her children? Or why not? Just because of the objective demands of work.
Right.
I would
but
say
the law forbids this, right?
The law would forbid that. Let's talk about the military. I mean, that's sort of an obvious one for me. I mean,
right.
I don't think young women who are in their fertile years are meant to be deployed. That's just not compatible with the mission of the military. I'm very happy to see Mary Harrington, willing to say that. It seems so obvious, but yeah, we can start there.
And above all, I mean, I think children is the most important thing to stress in a way, because there's so much focus on what can women do, what can women have it all, can women, are women able to, balance these things? And it's like, well, okay, but, you don't really want to be having to pencil in time for your children. That's actually supposed to be sort of the default ground of everything. And that's true. People will say, well, fathers should spend more time with their children too. And that's true. No father should put his career over his family. And yet it does look different. And the Catholic social teaching very clearly reflects that difference, because, well, you have, again, popes from Leo XIII up through John Paul II saying it's deplorable for women to be forced out of the home by economic conditions. They never say it's deplorable for men to be forced out of the home by economic conditions.
No, that's
they simply say men should be paid a just family wage.
That's exactly
right. They never worry about men being forced out of the home. As true as it is that there's issues, and we'll talk about it later, with this current situation where work is so detached from the home. That's a separate issue, but it doesn't actually get rid of the difference between the sexes. On even making that observation doesn't get rid of the difference between the sexes.
From a political economic point, I'm very much of a third wayer. I like Christopher Lasch. I like Alan Carlson. I love Ivan Illich, his book Gender, and their criticism of what happened to the home after industrialism. I mean, we need to talk about that. But the both the tradition of the maternalists, who are, from outside the Catholic world, but also the tradition of Catholic social teaching, they're both operating, they're both speaking after the Industrial Revolution has taken place. They're fully aware of the hit that the home has taken, and yet there's the last form of home production, which would be, birth, breastfeeding. They're adamant about that not being removed from the home. And so even if the home has become a somewhat empty place with no production going on, there's a kind of non-negotiable for both of them, and that is the mother cannot be separated from her child.
Right.
And it seems to me that's so. I mean, you bring up the father caring for his children. I mean, the way I put it is, fathers and mothers both work and they both care, but they do it differently.
Right.
So,
there's this phrase, quality time, right? Spending quality time with your children. You coined this phrase in the article, like the actual children, they need quantity time with their mothers.
Yeah. Right. I mean, mothers care. I mean, if by care we mean sort of more a kind of direct attention, or some kind of work that's more directly focused on children, well, that looks different for fathers and mothers. And it's going to involve for mothers quantity time, more quantity time, more sort of body-to-body time. I mean, that's just sort of obvious in the sort of very structure of pregnancy.
Especially in those early years, not just for a year, for a few years at least. And you said up to 16 was the old policy, right?
That's right, yeah. So, I mean, but, fathers and mothers care. I mean, there's a sort of new line now that fathers should start caring. Well, that's code right now for interchangeability. In the new line, it's parents who share the care. I mean, parents have always shared the care, but they've done it differently.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that even people in our milieu, in our world, who are maybe Catholics, who describe themselves as Catholic feminists, who celebrate sex difference, they are using this language, caregiver, and things like that. Generic language.
Yeah, absolutely. So the language of mother and father has been replaced by parents, and caregiving is sort of sexless now.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, a mother would care, by enfolding the child. The father might care for the child by defending the house. The mother might care by making the house. The father might care by building the house or fixing the house. Fathers have, the thing is, in the current narrative, I mean, at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is we're trying to sort of tweak society so that women can pursue goals with the same degree of intensity, professional goals with the same degrees of intensity that men can. That's the goal. And in order to sort of get to that goal, fathers need to change diapers and hold bottles. It's not enough that fathers have been sort of fixing fences, fixing cars, changing the oil, unplugging the toilets, setting the mouse traps. Those would all be instances of fathers involved in care, or taking the children hiking, or throwing the children up in the air, in the way that they do, in the way that they care uniquely. What they're supposed to do now is to be interchangeable caregivers of very young children in the home. And that, I don't know how that doesn't mean in the end doing an injustice to the woman's unique role in caring for her children in the first 3 years, which includes breastfeeding, which is something that's not interchangeable.
Right. So we're already sort of on the edge of talking about the Industrial Revolution and how that affected work. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit before we get into Catholic social teaching, which develops in this context, right? So that when people want to say, oh, well, it's the Industrial Revolution that makes men go out of the home, as though therefore it was the Industrial Revolution that increased the differences between women and men, but that's not really the case. So you cite some Ivan Illich talking about, pre-industrial or non-industrial societies having this still fairly regimented division of labor between women and men, even when work was more around the home and directly in the local
absolutely.
community.
Sure. So first of all, I take for granted that it's a very bad thing that the home has become a relatively empty place. I mean, that there's no production that takes place. It's economically irrelevant. I think suburbanization is not a happy thing. Suburbanization was an effort to remove people from the sort of embedded networks of village or urban life that they had before, where they helped each other out and ran into each other and bothered each other and so on. Christopher Lasch has written a lot about that. I appreciate him very much. And so he's written about how the home became a kind of haven from the heartless world. A haven from the heartless world. That's worth reading. And so the couple now is burdened with becoming kind of an emotional haven for each other. That makes a marriage impossible. They're no longer bound together by material necessities. They have to supply the sort of emotional support. Marriage has become reduced to an emotional union. That's impossible. He then describes how there were movements let's bring industrial models into the home. Let's make the homemaker a household engineer, a purchasing agent. Let's bring in the logic of the factory into the home. So home economics took place. But as Lasch, but also other people like Alan Carlson describe, that brings a kind of foreign logic into the home. And eventually it was precisely people in home economics, sort of feminists in home economics, who sort of brought an end to home economics. It just said, we've got to get out of here. We just got to get out of the house. So before, I mean, often feminists today will point to the 50s and say, the house, there's nothing traditional about the home in the 1950s. And I pretty much agree with that. Except there was a lot more marriage, there was a lot less divorce, and there were more children. So there is some continuity there. But there is something really modern about the home in the 50s. And I kind of agree with Betty Friedan, that the home has become a comfortable concentration camp. I mean, it's and there were good reasons to worry about, what had become of the home. I mean, if I could just, some examples. I'm fascinated by housekeeping rituals, and there's a woman who wrote a book about this recently, and said that in the 50s women were advised to dust the entire house every day, for example.
Wow.
So there's a kind of like make work thing going on,
because
there was not really good work to be doing, so
right.
It was make work.
In other words, they're not weaving or stuff that
no,
actually
they're not
matters.
Doing much, so
yeah.
That, and then there's a sort of excessive hovering over the children, and Betty Friedan was worried about that. She was actually worried about boys becoming homosexual.
Huh.
Interestingly enough, so this I agree with. I'm equally critical about that period. I'm on board with that. But then you're supposed to imagine that the division of labor is something simply modern and bad. But in fact, I mean, the division of labor is ancient. The cultural anthropologist Levi Strauss said that in every culture, you had a division of labor, and division of labor wasn't only determined by natural necessity. So obviously, only women can breastfeed. Okay, that's a natural necessity. But that natural necessity would also be brought up into the whole of life. the whole of cultural life in the household and in society. And the point was to solidify the need that the sexes had for each other, just as they are necessary to each other in the work of generating a child, giving birth to a child, feeding the child. So too that all the cultural practices and customs, which had men doing this over here and women doing that over there, were meant to solidify the necessity that they had for each other. A lot of those customs did have to do, though, with the fact, and here's the point, that the fact that women had to be in proximity to their children. That's what distinguishes a woman's care, is proximity, bodily proximity. So the kind of work that women typically did was work that could be done in proximity to children. It could be safe and it could be interrupted by children. And so if men and women worked on the same estate, the same farm, women kept the chickens near the house and men went out to, sow the fields, for example. So the division of labor is a kind of, in my opinion, a very beautiful kind of practice that brings out, what makes us necessary to each other. We give each other what the other doesn't have. We give each other what the other doesn't have.
And today we are trying to minimize the difference, not even just in labor, but in general, expressed differences of sex to the purely biological. I mean, again, even some Catholic writers are trying to do that. Like, as opposed to, not only does grace build on nature, but convention and artifice and culture build on nature. So
right.
It doesn't make sense to say we have these natural differences, but culture is going to de-emphasize them as much as possible. No, we're going to celebrate them. Of course, there are equalities and sameness, aspects of sameness that can be expressed in culture as well. But it doesn't make sense to say we're just going to make the world less colorful and interesting.
No, I mean,
that's how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, this is operating on the assumption that there's a dualism between nature and nurture, or nature and culture, or nature and education, and modernity is very much breathing those fumes. And I mean, we are biologically cultural beings, in this sense that the human infant, unlike all of its animal peers, is born a year too early. Biologists say that. In this sense, that it takes us a year to accomplish what our animal peers accomplish on day one in terms of our species-specific form of communication, locomotion, and proportion. So the human infant takes a year to achieve what an elephant infant or a horse infant achieves on day one. And what's really interesting about that is that means that for us, we have to achieve ourselves. We have to achieve ourselves in the light of day through our own freedom. What our animal peers achieve, so to speak, is achieved for them in the darkness of their mother's wombs. But also, we achieve ourselves through our freedom also by being in the social womb of the family. So were we not to be carried around by our mothers and breastfeed by our mothers, we would not learn to stand up on our own 2 feet. We would not learn human speech.
Right.
So it
actually means that just the physical protection and nurturing automatically develops has to happen for long enough that it kind of a matter of course develops an aspect of education that other animals don't have. I mean, if our children were able to run around immediately after birth, we might be more apt to just let them do their thing, than we would to sort of completely induct them into our world.
Yeah, we are physiologically or biologically in need of education. In other words, there's nothing. It's not a construct. So the idea that it's a construct is a construct, and enter the word stereotype. You cannot. There's no place in our vocabulary anymore for custom. Immediately the word stereotype will be trotted out. And the idea of a stereotype is a sort of rigid thing that sort of, just imposed from the outside. And that's why I made the comment before, is just as we wouldn't learn to stand up or speak without the influence of our parents and our neighbors and our teachers, so too we wouldn't grow up properly as boys and girls without customs that trained us both in awareness of our distinction, but also in view of the eventual union that was, that's in the offing, right, in the future. And so every culture had girls and boys dress differently. They learned dances. One started with one foot, the other started with the other foot, and so on. And there's, it's where you see this is in the a recent debate over gender. A lot of conservatives jumped on board with the TERF feminists. The TERF feminists were so-called pejoratively by gender ideologues because they were old-style radical feminists who were against transgenderism. And Germaine Greer, for example, or Helen Joyce is a great example. She wrote a great book called Trans, and it's a really nice sort of account of the history of transgenderism. But she's a TERF, so a trans exclusionary radical feminist or something like that. I got the acronym. It's a pejorative acronym used of them. But right. Anyway, the argument is kind of interesting, and I don't buy it at all. I mean, the argument is that we're against transgenderism because transgenderism is stereotypical. We women have finally gotten to a point where we can behave however the hell we want. I'm quoting Helen Joyce. Why should we, who want to act, like wear what men wear or act like men, why should we have to become a man? So, in other words, the idea is they want to affirm that we are women, but to sort of empty out womanhood of anything other than just the sort of basic biological substratum. I have a female reproductive system. But the idea is to sort of empty out womanhood from anything else, right? A manner of behaving, acting, speaking, dressing, and so on, that would order me towards the opposite sex. So a lot of conservatives sort of, saw this as an occasion here, and I grant that, sometimes you can make common cause with people you don't fundamentally agree with. But what I noticed is that a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon of the stereotype thing, that, they're right that transgenderism is wrong because it holds to stereotypes, and we're against stereotypes. Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to die on the hill of biological sex with these radical feminists. That's what matters, is biological sex. And we're gonna renounce any kind of custom education of boys and girls that belongs to the millennia old tradition.
I think you see that, at least to some extent, in the writing of Abigail Favale. For instance, a piece she wrote in Church Life Journal recently, because she, in various places, she really focuses focuses on biological sex, which is obviously not inappropriate. But then she kind of says, well, the only thing that really makes men's activities and men's work and women's activities and women's work differently is simply that it's a biological man or a biological woman doing it. And therefore, they will do the same work, but in different modes. So she's sort of trying to affirm that, yes, there will be a difference in, the way that they do the work somehow, but, we're not actually allowed to, but she'll make arguments either philosophically or using studies or whatever to argue that, well, actually we're not that different in terms of outwardly roles and such, essentially, I guess you might say.
It's a little confusing what you're saying, because I like the language of mode. I mean, I think that men and women are two distinct modes of humanity. That is, we do everything differently. Absolutely.
Right. But what she's saying is that the same tasks, the same roles.
Oh yeah.
But just done in different modes. In other words, I'm going to be a little bit of a different kind of lawyer, and I'm going to approach the law differently because I'm a biological woman. But we really can't say any more about what it means to what my identity of a woman is, other than that I am biologically a woman, and that sort of in this sort of intangible, undefinable way affects the way I do all the same things.
Well, if you want to talk about mode, you're going to have to say something about what that is. I mean, you do need to define it. And yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with the article you're talking about, but of course I know and I respect Abigail very much. I know there's a lot of talk about people have a kind of allergic reactions when you talk about traits.
Well, she was citing a study that was claiming that really, men and women are different in their personality traits and emotional traits and things like that, but it's really not that different. It's kind of almost a marginal difference from what I remember.
I mean, that's just hard to imagine. I mean, there is so much evidence now. We know so much more about this now than we did 20 years ago. How profoundly the hormones in the development of the child in utero affect the development of the brain, for example. Mm-hmm. I mean, read someone like Timothy Fortin just wrote a great book on sexual difference, where he sort of lays all of the recent research out. I mean, it's just hard to imagine anyone who could deny this. There's been so much on brain sex, so to speak. It's hard to deny that, there's even a thing in medicine called gender medicine, which isn't what you think it is, but it means that you can't study the kidney without taking into account the fact that it's the kidney of a woman or a man. I mean, the difference between sexes permeates everything. I mean, literally, of course, it's in every cell. It's hard to imagine anyone downplaying that. On the other hand, we're very complex beings. So because we're biologically cultural beings, our culture can do a lot to undermine our development, right? So we can do pretty well educating androgynous young people. And that's not a proof that we're androgynous, or it's not a proof that there aren't differences. It's simply a proof of how vulnerable our nature is to our educators, right? So then the real question is whether our educators or our cultural formators, our parents, are going to educate us according to the telltale signs of our nature, or are going to try to override it. Because we can do a lot to override what we are. So the fact that you sort of, you do a sort of poll among your fellow students of, how do you feel about these traits? That doesn't tell us anything. Let's say all the kids you poll say, I don't identify with that male trait or the female trait. All that tells us is that in this given moment in time, sexual difference has been sort of educated out of us. Right. That doesn't mean that tells us anything about the nature of things.
Right. So that follows along with what I was thinking. I just glanced at the part of her article I was thinking about again, and basically she said that this study that she was basing her findings on was saying that yes, there are statistically significant differences in traits between men and women. They're statistically significant, but they're actually they're small. They're not large, and so that basically most men and women fall closer to the average of those traits than they do to being different from one another or something like that. And that I think goes along with what you're saying, that this is being trained out of us also.
But I mean, is it the kind of thing where you're asking people, do you identify with this trait?
Yeah, it was self-assessments. 15,000 men and women completing self-assessments on their traits.
That doesn't mean anything, because there's also there's the ideology of the air, that's informing how we're supposed to answer these questions.
And I think implicit in what you're saying is that the argument about cultural construction can cut both ways, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the question is, when you bring up a child, are you trying to bring him or her up according to his, given nature as a boy or a girl? Or are you trying to root that out? We've done a lot. We're very successful at rooting a lot of this out.
And by the way, there was a really interesting couple things here. A really interesting, good article by Matthew Meehan, a Catholic writer.
I know him. I know Matthew.
Yeah. Did you see his piece? It was about, I think it was by him, or at least he shared it. It was about the importance of single-sex schools for boys. For if you want boys not to go to toxic online influencers, they need real life male role models, and the importance of single-sex schools for that. But another thing I was going to just quickly mention, we don't have to get into it, is just to your point about educating children according to sex difference. Pius XI's encyclical on education, Divini Ilius Magistri, condemns the principle of coeducation, because he says actually the same kind of education is not, and information is not appropriate for both boys and girls.
That's interesting. Wow.
It's only like a paragraph or so in that whole, encyclical, but it's very interesting.
Well, I don't know what to say about that now. I mean,
I think he condemns the idea that kind of you should educate them in the same way and for the same goals.
That's the point. That's the point. And it's not possible to conceive of education while not taking into account the vocation that boys and girls are eventually called to, which in the end is a vocation of marriage, or something like marriage at a higher level. And so I suppose that's what's behind that statement. And at that level, I agree with it.
He doesn't use the word principle. He says method. But he says by many of its supporters, it's founded upon naturalism and the denial of original sin. So there's a prudence aspect that he's referring to.
You might be concerned about modesty too.
Yes, that's definitely true, because he talks about protecting girls' modesty in gymnastic exercises and public exhibitions and stuff like that. But he says it's founded by many of its supporters, above all, upon a deplorable confusion of ideas that mistakes a leveling promiscuity and equality for the legitimate association of the sexes. The Creator has ordained and disposed perfect union of the sexes only in matrimony, and with varying degrees of contact in the family and society. And then he goes on to, there's nothing in nature which suggests that there can be or should be equality in the training of the two sexes, that they're complementary, and these differences must be maintained and encouraged during their formative years, and with due separation according to time and circumstances.
I'm open to what's behind that. You can't educate human beings abstracting from the goal, which is
right.
Which is the goal is the achievement of adulthood, which was defined until recently as marriage.
And of course, it's different different for him to say that in the early 20th century, when these things are being introduced, than it is for us to say, well, we just have to nuke everything now, and we sort of can't make use of the institutions we have, or in other words, there's obviously some prudential flexibility that's needed to be able to educate your children at all in the current circumstances. So,
sure, and yet a lot of the schools, a lot of the best schools are either single sex or they have both sexes, but depending on the age of the children, and for different reasons, they separate the sexes for different kinds of instruction. I love that. I'm kind of familiar with that second model. I kind of almost prefer it because I like the fact that the sexes are sort of in view of each other. And yet it's important for various reasons, to sort of separate them out.
Right.
One is that they're at different levels, when they're younger.
Right.
In high school, the problem is distraction. That seems to be the Pope's main concerns, on modesty and all that. And then another reason is, insofar as you're also educating for future profession and work.
That's right, yeah.
Which isn't essentially what education is simply about.
He manages to convey all of that in kind of a one paragraph of all these different dimensions of the problem.
For sure. Yeah, and I might mention, Edith Stein, who, of course, educated girls and educated educators, said quite clearly that there's a kind of, both men and women educate their children, but women educate them in a primary way, as their sort of primary activity. Fathers, their secondary activity. So they're coming at it from a different angle.
And I have to say, from the little I've read of her, I think that her thought is really being glossed over, and she's being invoked as kind of a name to drop by certain figures, but actually not dealing with. I mean, people. Actually, a female friend of mine was putting on a sort of a theatrical performance that drew on her writings on woman, and she came across the famous quote. I lent her my copy of Stein's Essays on Women, which I actually haven't even read the whole thing up, but she found the famous quote about woman as like a haven for souls. I'm really paraphrasing this, but you know what I'm talking about. That she's supposed to be someone who can sort of contain other souls and give them nurture and develop them, something like that. But the other part of that same sentence is like, and be subordinate to man, or something like that. She says that in the very same sentence, and people don't quote that part.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. She would have.
It's just an example.
She has a sense of an ordered household. So there are, again, this is the point. Modality is important, but modality would also mean also different ordering.
Modality with an actual concrete effect.
Ordering and also different weightings. So obviously, both men and women, let's go to generation, they both generate a child, don't they? And they do it in a different mode, don't they? But there's also different weighting. So for a man, the act of generation is a very short act. And it happens outside the body. For a woman, it's a very long act and it happens inside the body. So it's not just a different mode, but also different weighting. And so that means that a woman has a kind of primary mission in the home. Okay, this Edith Stein would have said this. All the popes said it. John Paul II said it. A primary mission of the woman in the home. So the hospitality she gives to the child in her body is sort of carried over to the home, where she makes the home hospitable to human beings. There's a sort of, and the thing is, this is so universal and so ancient. It's almost ridiculous to have to talk about it. But the reason we have to talk about it is this unfortunate problem, and that is that the common life has been taken out of the home. And this is a point that Christopher Lasch makes. And I do think that's something that has to be seriously dealt with.
Okay. So let's get into Catholic social teaching on the topic of, women and men, work and home. And I'll just make two general points before we get into some of these texts. First of all, looking back at the discussion about the Industrial Revolution, is a lot of sort of when you quote late 19th, early 20th century popes on this topic of women and work outside the home, the response there's sort of a canned talking point from some Catholic feminists who will say, well, they'll invoke the Industrial Revolution. In other words, well, that's different because, it's wrong for men to be taken out of the home too, and blah, blah, blah. And this different work being taken out of the local community, all that stuff. Yeah. And as we've said, those are valid points. However, all of these documents, the entire period of what we refer to as Catholic social teaching, is a post-industrial development, right. And it is making recommendations for precisely these circumstances. Right, so it's not like those teachings just become outdated. Right. And then secondly, of course, is the point that, and this is true more broadly than work outside the home, and I will link to my series of articles on these questions as well, because in the second article, I took a look at, well, it's very common for people to sort of act as though Pope John Paul II overturned all these previous teachings, which are now obsolete, from, say, Leo XIII, Pius XI, and popes like that, who, by the way, are not even that long ago. But I made a point of showing the consistency on this and some other points relating to men and women between John Paul II and those earlier popes on topics that are contested with the debate over feminism within the church. And so I think that's very important to sort of look at those things in terms of their evident continuity on points like this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a kind of hermeneutic of discontinuity, right? And there's just a sort of a consistent teaching. Leo XIII, Pius XI, Pius XII, John Paul II, about speaking about the mother's sort of unique relation in the home. John Paul II will speak of the primary goals of the mission of the mother, her irreplaceable role, what is specific to the woman. Yeah.
I think we'll get into John Paul II a little more because there's a number of interesting passages to cite from him, and he's going to be the guy that people are going to be most open to listening to, because some people just have a tendency to sort of be dismissive of these earlier popes as though this is all now outdated or something. But I do want to quote Leo XIII quickly and Pius XI quickly to show the continuity. So here's Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum.
Okay.
Women are not suited for certain occupations. A woman is by nature fitted for homework, and it is that which is best adapted at once to preserve her modesty and to promote the good bringing up of children and the well-being of the family. And then here is Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno, which is named because it's the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. Mothers concentrating on household duties should work primarily in the home or in its immediate vicinity. Now, no, he doesn't say shouldn't work. He said work primarily in the home or in its immediate vicinity. Continuing, it is an intolerable abuse and to be abolished at all cost for mothers on account of the father's low wage to be forced to engage in gainful occupations outside the home to the neglect of their proper cares and duties, especially the training of children. And then, we can discuss various I think that the two important encyclicals from John Paul II are his encyclical on work, Laborem Exercens, and also his encyclical on the family, Familiaris Consortio. There's some important source texts on this topic in both of those encyclicals. But where would you like to start as far as that goes?
Well, I mean, so there's the compendium. The compendium, of course, is 2004. I mean, I would note the family wage is. A lot of people would say the things we're talking about are kind of non-starters, right? Well, the family wage is a non-starter, and yet somehow the church sort of, as late as 2004.
You're talking about the compendium of the social doctrine of the church.
That's right, which gathers up all of these teachings. Leo XIII, by the way, we should remind ourselves, it was considered this great modern pope because he came out after the pope who wrote this syllabus.
I'm actually currently doing a lengthy series of podcasts and articles going through his most important encyclicals right now, and so
interesting. That's great.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's the concern that women be again in proximity to their children because of what children are and what women are, what mothers are. There's also sort of things about just the making of a home. There's something about a house is not a home is not a house. We can mention Pius XII as well, who wrote sort of many letters to newlyweds that are worth reading and looking at. But
it's not just that women have duties towards their children. I mean, they also have duties towards their husbands and vice versa.
Yeah. So that's sort of
as far as the home is concerned,
civilizing the dwelling, that they live in.
Right.
He speaks
the hearth.
about
the hearth.
Pius XII is interesting in his letters to newlyweds. He says, he's worried about women who are. He's worried about the industrial, the post-industrial situation as well. Work has been taken out of the home, men have been taken out. Shouldn't women Wouldn't it be natural for them to do so too? And he says, it's a sacrifice. Many women complain about the sacrifice, but they're not the only one making sacrifices. This is a point that's worth noting: is that when people say, "Well, men should make sacrifices too," I mean, again, they already do. A lot of men with children have to choose jobs they'd rather not do, precisely because they have children,
or work multiple jobs.
Or multiple jobs, right? I mean, I have a friend who got a PhD in theology, and then he ended up having 9 children. He decided, I can't do this. I'm going to be an insurance salesman. Okay, so probably he's not thrilled about that job switch, but it's a sacrifice, right? It's not like he's going out and fulfilling his potential. Most people working aren't, developing their potential. A lot of them are just providing for themselves and presumably doing good also for the world, but it might not be something that develops your talent or what have you. They're
not Karl Marx's dream of the well-rounded man who goes out fishing one day and hunting another day and writes a novel in the next day, right. And I forget the exact quote, but yeah,
that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I mean, and then one thing I like to point out, I mean, with John Paul II, I mean, you have statements about, especially when he got a lot of criticism toward the end of the millennium about all the things he was saying about women in Mulieris Dignitatem. It was very he was accused of stereotyping. So then he wrote a document. A letter to women in which he says, women shouldn't be excluded from professional training. They should be given access to them. He never says equal access, by the way. And there are always these qualifications and caveats. For example, the labor process should be organized and adapted in such a way as to respect the requirements of the person and his or her forms of life. Above all, life in the home, taking into account the individual's age and sex. So, who is this woman? How old is she? Is she married? Does she have children? How old are they? And all of that, Then there are always these adversatives when he says, women in many societies work in every sector of life, but it is fitting that they should be able to fill their tasks in accordance with their own nature. Okay. Or there's no doubt that the equal dignity and responsibility of men and women fully justifies women's access to public functions. On the other hand, the true advancement of women requires the clear recognition be given to the value of the maternal and family role in comparison with all other public roles and all other professions. Nothing like that is said about men. And that's what I mean about, if you talk about sexual differences being two distinct modes of being the same thing, there are also different weightings. Or, while it must be recognized that women and men have the same right to perform various public functions, society must be structured in such a way that wives and mothers are not, in practice, compelled to work outside the home.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
The mentality which honors women more for their work outside the home than for their work within the family must be overcome. Society should create and develop conditions favoring work in the home. So when you take these texts about sort of structuring society in the workplace.
And what text are you reading from there, by the way?
I'm reading Familiaris Consortio.
Okay.
Familiaris Consortio. Right. So, yeah, this brings us to the big, what to do. Well, I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but obviously I think it's normal for women to want to, engage in productive activity, to be engaged in cultural life. By the way, Christopher Lasch, again, in his book, I think, The Haven from the Heartless Home, he speaks about how much women were actually considered to be more social than men. I think the novel, is it called American Society or something, describes about how women were much more social and men were more private because they were engaged in their own sort of narrow professional sphere, whereas women were doing all kinds of cultural activities. So, in other words, it's perfectly reasonable and to be expected and desirable that women, who are human beings after all, want to engage in cultural life, political life, economic life. The question is, what form does that take? Yeah, I mean, I guess I would rely on Edith Stein's sort of formulation that we're both meant to rule creation, but that's, according to Edith Stein, man's primary vocation and woman's secondary vocation.
This makes me think about, and I can't give a citation for this, but I've heard it said that statistically, men tend to fall more in the extremes and in various things, and women tend to be more in the center. In other words, there's more like men are more likely to be either geniuses or complete social outcasts and homeless and all of this stuff, and women are more likely to be sort of generally competent in sort of like a baseline level of like functionality and competence under all kinds of different circumstances. But they have all these talents, and I think that there's an argument to be made from that for why they are very suited towards the education of their children, because you're not supposed to specialize in one thing when you're educating your children. You need to make them well-rounded, right? And give this overall human foundation. So I think there is an argument there. Of course, men take a very important role in education as well. But I think in terms of, the home is supposed to be a sort of also a kind of a microcosm of society as well. And so it has to have all these things. It's not a perfect society like the state or like the church, but it's supposed to be to have a sort of a range of human experience within it. And so I don't know, I'm just sort of rambling, but you see what I'm getting at.
Not. I mean, both Chesterton and Edith Stein say this, that the man is a kind of specialist and a woman is a jack of all trades.
Okay.
And he's he really lays into the feminists of his day, who were first wave feminists, by the way, who just had a generally egalitarian spirit. And he said, a man teaches everybody the rule of three, sort of this mathematical principle. A woman teaches her child the meaning of the whole world. Why is one better than the other? By the way, I mean, my entire interest in these questions has to do with my fundamental insight when I was a young teenager in a very female-dominant family, and that is that all feminism is driven by an inferiority complex. I'm convinced that what drives all feminism is the idea that what women sort of have to do or do is judged to be something lower than what men do. But anyway, your point about Edith Stein speaks about the woman's well-roundedness, precisely. Apropos of the recent science on this stuff, we know that there's a biological support for this in the way the brain is wired. Pardon the metaphor, but the way the brain is set up, and the female brain is generally much more networked. The male brain is much more compartmentalized. That's not a good or bad thing. These are both geniuses. It allows for a male typically to tunnel things out so he can specialize and focus on things, and allows for women to multitask, as we say. These are things that we know with ever more certainty the more we study these things. Not ask people how they feel about traits, but actually study, the brain.
But then on the other hand, there is a sense in which women specialize in terms of, being more relational, being more person oriented, whereas a man might have to govern the big picture without so much being concerned about the feelings of any one person, right? And that's why sort of statecraft is traditionally sort of the male pursuit, and being in a family situation where it's really about the relationship with each individual taken fully into account is this probably connects to Helen Andrews' argument about law and stuff as well.
And there's a good reason for this, is that one of the geniuses of a woman, and people like Carl Stirner wrote a great book called The Flight from Women, and what's notable in decades past, you have all these great men writing wonderful books about women. Carl Stern, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and John Paul II. And they characteristically uplift women and say all kinds of wonderful things about women, and then criticize themselves. What's needed now is for women to do the same with men and say positive things about men and maybe a few critical things about themselves. But, Carl Stern makes this point about women. I mean, because of the experience of pregnancy, they have a real sense of the individuality of their child. And the vice of that is that they're very prejudiced. So they can't stand if their child doesn't win the race, for example. But a man is more capable of taking a distance from that and putting his child, in the context of the larger crowd, right?
So getting back to work, let me read a couple of quotes from John Paul II's encyclical on work, Laborum Exercens. First passage I'll read. It will redound to the credit of society to make it possible for a mother, without inhibiting her freedom, without psychological or practical discrimination, and without penalizing her as compared with other women, to devote herself to taking care of her children and educating them in accordance with their needs, which vary with age. Having to abandon these tasks in order to take up paid work outside the home is wrong from the point of view of the good of society and of the family when it contradicts these primary goals of the mission of a mother. So John Paul II always giving people room for their legitimate freedoms is when it contradicts these primary goals of the mission of a mother. So he's granted this freedom to women who want to do some work, maybe some part-time work, while raising children, or maybe some part-time work in the home now that we have, working from home and things like that. As long as it's not contradicting those primary duties. And here's the kicker, though, is that I think people tend to magnify what may be an exceptional case into, well, it's completely relative to each person, what their capacity is, and it's completely everybody's own judgment as to their, what is serving their family. And yes, but that takes a real honesty. That takes a real clear-sightedness about what the needs of your children are. It's very easy for both men and women in this regard to short shrift their children and tell themselves that their children are doing fine. So hence the quality time construct, right? It's okay. We're getting quality time. It's not quantity time, but it's quality time. And we convince ourselves. So I think there's a lot of self-deception in this area, even with part-time work.
Absolutely.
But still, it's there. That stipulation is there for John Paul II. So he's allowing that possibility.
Yeah. If women can have it all, do children have it all?
Right.
That's your question.
Right. There was an article. There was an article about that recently. I think the title was women can have it all, but can their children, or something like that.
That's a great article, and it's a response to the Wall Street Journal article about conservative women who are basically just upper middle class, obviously conservative women. Right. And by the way, one of the characters in that article, who was working for the president, and I guess going back and forth from Houston. FaceTiming her children and all that. I mean, what it didn't tell you is that she had just quit.
You mean the characters in the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah. So it was a little dishonest, but
sort of like Saint Gianna Molla for the good of her children.
I did not know that.
Yeah, she discerned with her husband. She said, once we have 4 children, I'm just going to quit.
Interesting.
Yeah. So nobody really mentions that.
Nobody says that. Yeah. Nobody knows that. They use her, in fact.
Well, this is like a very typical. It happens with anybody from Joan of Arc, Edith Stein, John Paul II.
Right.
These get name dropped and selectively quoted.
Right. Whereas Joan of Arc was doing something that the men wouldn't do. She wanted the men to do this.
She also had an apparition.
Because they wouldn't, she had to do it.
Yeah.
So no, I wanted to say that we're really good at burdening children with the effects of our sort of liberal choices, basically. And we did this with divorce. We had a divorce culture for
I had that in mind
decades. Too, yeah. And we told ourselves, good liberal citizens need to be able to contract in and out of relationships so that we can be free. And that means we need to tell ourselves that it's good for children. It's better for them to have a good divorce than a bad marriage. They're doing okay. So okay are they doing? They actually have two families that love them.
They're resilient, right?
There were all kinds of books written for children on the good divorce and how good they had it, with little animals. Until in around 2010, some really interesting authors started writing as adult children of divorce. Elizabeth Marquardt wrote her book Between Two Worlds, and it said this is not good. This is not good. And what was really interesting about that literature is that it required us to sort of reevaluate what marriage was. The children themselves were sort of an image of what the marriage was, and the children were not good. They were being literally torn apart. And so that required us to reevaluate what we were telling ourselves about marriage. That marriage should be this sort of fungible thing that we can we can enter and exit sort of, when at whim or at will. So yeah, I mean, we have to ask ourselves about the children. I think we have to make, in my article, I admit the neighborly landscape for young women having children, I'm thinking my own daughter, is not ideal. It can be very lonely out there.
Sure.
But I think you should begin with the most vulnerable, and that's the children. And my analogy is, without getting into homeschooling, it's just an analogy, is that what parents did back in the early 80s, I think, perhaps even before then, when they looked at the educational landscape, they saw choices that were not optimal. And they said, either the schools aren't good or we can't afford the good ones. We're going to start homeschooling. Now, that was a decision to be very socially alienated and very lonely, right? And then our children are going to be lonely, right? Well, what happened? But they made a choice. Maybe it wasn't optimal, but they made a choice in favor of their children, what was best for their children. What happened is this sort of oasis. Was bloomed in the desert. The oasis of social life. And they generated a whole new culture. A culture of schools, a culture of cooperatives, and lots of company. And I think that's the way to go. So to go out on a limb, accept reality and accept it with gusto. I mean, motherhood is a wonder. Being with your children is a wonderful thing for a woman. That's what we want. That's what we mostly want, we women. And go with that, and then find a way to adapt work to that instead of the opposite, which is kind of what we're trying to do.
That's right. Yeah.
Kind of Catholic feminist version.
So just to quote one more thing from John Paul II on labor policy, again, Laborum Exercens, he's talking about just remuneration for workers.
Yeah.
He says, such remuneration can be given either through what is called a family wage, that is a single salary given to the head of the family for his work, sufficient for the needs of the family without the other spouse having to take up gainful employment outside the home, or through other social measures such as family allowances or grants to mothers devoting themselves exclusively to their families. So he explicitly supports the kind of sex discrimination that you would support. I mean, that's remarkable. Wow, this isn't the 1920s. This is whatever, late 80s that he writes this. A single salary given to the head of the family. Oh, great. Mutual submission, great, but he still believes there is such a thing as a head of a family.
That's right. That's right.
And then, likewise, even in cases where the father can't work or there is no father, grants to mothers devoting themselves exclusively to their families. So that is the opposite of the Hungary policy that I mentioned earlier.
That's exactly the same policy that the social reformers called the maternalists had also.
Okay.
So this is the response, the rejoinder to those who say, well, what about single mothers? So let's not pretend this is actually about single mothers. This is really about upper middle class women who want to sort of develop their potential, which is, of course, not in the abstract, not a bad thing. But what about single mothers, so that the poor? Well, the answer was, for the social reformers, a mother's pension, and then for John Paul II, these other measures, right?
Right.
So there's a completely different ideal at work, and that is, there's a non-negotiable here, and that is infants and young children should not be separated from their mothers bodily. That it just comes down to that.
Now, yeah, I mean, and the overall point is, people want to say, well, it's up for each family to decide. It's up to personal discernment, personal gifts, personal fulfillment, and it's like, yes, but it's not so relative to each person's situation as people want to make it out, as far as what the church says. Like the church leaves legitimate freedom. John Paul II very much leaves legitimate freedom for individual situations and circumstances, but there is a definite bias towards mothers, doing their work, whatever that may be, in the home.
Absolutely.
And having it focus on their children above all.
It comes down to the fact that women are the ones who get pregnant. They give birth and they nurse their children. We have to keep bringing in breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is an extension of birth, and that's not, in my opinion, that should not be something left up to individual choice. There's it's an extension of the birth process. Most conservative feminists wouldn't want to suggest that we could sort of exchange birth with other technological means. I would suggest that unless there was some extremely good reason, breastfeeding should not simply be tabled or simply exchanged with the bottle. I mean, there's a reason that the best food available for the child comes in the bodily package of the mother, and exactly at the exact distance that that child's eyes can focus and see the mother's face. That's a wonderful example of the sort of unity of biology and culture there. The child is being nourished while the child is being gazed at and spoken to, and that's that you can't minimize that. That has nothing to do with the kind of woman or freedom and choice and what. I don't think that's simply a matter of choice.
So before we I think we've pretty much gotten through your article and the different things discussed in it. There's another angle I'd like to bring up, which I discussed in stuff I wrote earlier this year, which is not the question of duties and obligations, whether women should work, whether women shouldn't work outside the home, but simply the kind of the implications of what happens when they do. And so we've got this, you mentioned the feminine genius, and there's this idea, well, women need to bring the world needs women's feminine genius, and that means they need to be more engaged in public life, in the workplace, in politics, things like that. Okay, so let's just assume that that's like in abstract a good idea, but let's see like what we actually have, like what has actually practically enabled that to happen. Okay, so women are currently 55% of professionals. Right. That, I think, is pretty clear, has been primarily enabled by contraception. Contraception is used by 65% of women between the age of 15 and 49. Mm-hmm. Okay, so from a Catholic perspective, this is a non-starter as far as the feminine genius is concerned, right? Because if you're suppressing your femininity by chemical or other means, you're not able to bring authentic femininity to your work. What you're bringing is a distorted and a pathological femininity to your workplace.
That's right.
And that would be the same if you have a family, but you're neglecting them. Or let's say if you're motivated to work because you fear being dependent on a husband's income, that is also a refusal of feminine vulnerability, right? And so there's a practical aspect, which is this debate over what percent of the workplace should be women wouldn't even be necessary, because if women stopped contracepting, this problem would sort of largely take care of itself. But on the other aspect is, like, from a Catholic perspective, we're talking about women bringing their gifts to society. Not that they're not. The main point is they're doing that by being mothers, obviously. But let's say in other ways in the professions, and we're not against that by any means, right? You are a public intellectual, right? So we're not against women being in different fields. But the question of, like, okay, so does that paradoxically, the value of that actually get diminished by the means that are taken to enable that, namely, first and foremost, contraception and abortion? I think if we take a step back from some of these debates about, are women, what women have to contribute to these fields, and just look at what is necessary to even bring them to that point. Yeah. From a Catholic perspective, the question becomes a lot simpler, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What to say? I mean, first of all, a lot of this is breathing the fumes of sort of, a 4-century long sort of liberal conception of the political order, which does not have as its basic cell the family. So if you understood the basic cell of the political order to be the family, you wouldn't have this idea of the public-private divide. A Catholic understanding of the political order does not think of the family as simply private. It's the basic cell of society. So it's already public. And to be raising the next generation of a political order citizens is not a private affair. That's absolutely public. And and then of course, most women, in an order where the family were the basic cell of society, there'd be a marriage culture, and most women would be getting married, a higher percentage of women, and most women would be having children, and there would be less representation of them in certain forms of occupation, obviously. That doesn't mean that they're not sort of influential. I think it's a bad idea of their influence as feminine doesn't have to have the same explicitness that a man's influence as masculine has to have. But John Paul II, and Gertrude von Lefort is one of the best authors on what a woman is. There's something hidden about the woman, and she writes this book called The Eternal Woman. That's really, really wonderful, and it's not entirely fresh on my mind right now, but thinks that you need man and woman for there to be a culture, and if you don't have man and woman, it'll be imbalanced. But she doesn't mean that woman kind of represents the givenness of nature, and that man typically is the one who initiates change. He's more sort of associated with techne and culture and craft. But if he's not making things and having dominion with an awareness of sort of givenness of nature as the sort of backdrop and framework for all cultural activity, then his cultural activity will be imbalanced. It will take the form of the technological paradigm, for example. So anyway, she thinks that she's the one who coined the term woman, feminine genius, by the way.
Oh yeah, okay.
Takes it from her, and so she thinks the woman should be exceedingly influential, but it doesn't mean that she's influential in the sense that she needs to be sort of represented in every sort of occupation and form of work in the way
influence, power, and authority are three distinct things, and we shouldn't sort of equate them, right? So like the obsession with power kind of can neglect influence, right? With a direct kind of power over others versus influence.
Yeah, you're right. It's not a sort of one-to-one correlation. There's a kind of background and hiddenness. Sort of women who aren't contracepting, and so who are marrying and having children, or spiritual mothers. There's a sort of educating children. Are going to have a profound influence, but it's not the same thing as running off to war, or conducting military campaigns. I would use the term of John Paul II. We're living in a structure of sin here, and most of us individuals. I mean, we can't change we're in an environment that has set things up so that we don't get married. That we don't get married early, and that means marriage becomes more and more difficult, and that means you have to you have to set yourself up so you can protect yourself and defend yourself and be independent, and that makes marriage more and more difficult. And so it has nothing to do with blaming individuals. I grew up in this environment too. I married later than I would have liked to marry. I had fewer children than I would have liked to have. I don't think I'm to blame for that. But we need to be honest about these patterns, these structures that lead to either to marriagelessness or difficulties in marriage, difficulties in having children, and work towards changing that. And there's some really interesting conversations going on right now about whether people should be on the education track until they're 28, 30, and whatnot. We should be open to talking about these things.
Well, you mentioned your own life experience, which leads me to ask, you are a mother and you do work, and so how do you relate everything we've been talking about to your own life?
I often get that question from my students. Well, what about you? And I say, well, I could be a hypocrite, and that doesn't make my arguments less valid. I could be a hypocrite, but I'm not in this case. I could have made the wrong choices, and I'm generous enough to tell the younger generation not to make those choices. That would be valid. That's not my case. Actually, I say to my students, life is long. I don't have, my youngest child is 25. I actually spent, when I was married, a little bit, I married when I was later, when I was older, and when I had children, I immediately went home, and I taught one course a week. I'd go out for 3 hours a week, basically, and I did that until my youngest child was basically finished with high school.
Wow. Okay.
So I came back.
How many kids do you have?
Three.
Okay.
By the grace of God, and then I came back into things. After that, and in a way late. So I sacrificed, good 20 years of going ahead, full steam ahead. But I consider it. The thing is,
So you did have it all, but just not all at once. In a sense, right?
Yeah, that's right. Not all at once. I mean, because I married late, I was able to have written a dissertation, but I would counsel young women, to set their lives up in such a way that they married earlier, which again isn't something we can just do on our own. I mean, we need to change the environment. So I'm very much interested in people who are hosting dances for young people and teaching young people to dance, and do other things to foster a courtship culture so that young people can get married earlier.
I think a lot of we're just talking about problems with young women, but, there's also this problem we see with, extreme right wing. I mean, I'm pretty extreme right wing, but maybe even more extreme right wing young men online with the Groypers, Nick Fuentes, and all that stuff. And I think a lot of that stuff is also driven by despair, just like I think a lot of radical ideology with young women is driven by despair, that they've grown up in this hostile world. And yes, there are ways in which it's worse for women and ways in which it's also worse for men. And I think a lot of that despair actually is just what you were talking about. I think there's a fundamental, things get really, you can look at, say, the economy's bad. You can say U.S. foreign policy is bad. I have the feeling that none of these things would matter quite so much. None of these things would be quite so upsetting or so dark if you thought, well, I can still have a good life. Yeah, I can still have a family. I can find a good woman or a good man. Right. Those things wouldn't sting as much, and we wouldn't sort of be looking as much for somebody to blame out there as much if we felt that we could have these things. So, and I'm 35 and I would like to be married, and I'm not yet. So I understand that. And I understand that it's even worse and harder for young men who are growing up and seeing, I can't see a single woman around me that I would want to be with, or things like that, and vice versa. Yeah. And so I think that is not to be underestimated as a cause of restlessness, discontent, and rage,
Well, the sexes, they define each other. They're correlative terms. You couldn't talk about men if you didn't talk about women. So when something goes wrong with one, it's necessarily going to create problems on the other side. Yeah. So of course things are messed up on both sides. But I do think that women have had the upper hand for a long time. Girls have been in the Girl Project for decades now. I think,
is that something like somebody named that, or did you just call it that?
I think maybe Kay Heimowitz or who wrote the divorce Whitehead. Okay. Maybe Whitehead, who wrote a book about divorce. Kay Heimowitz wrote about the maybe about that in Manhattan Institute. But given the anti-sex-discrimination regime, so called, I wonder how many men are out of work because of that. That has to be a frustrating problem. And then there's just been a vacuum created. There's nothing positive that's been said about men for decades, and that includes in the church. So I've heard about social media. I don't do social media. I think it's not social, actually.
Right.
It's antisocial. It's a form of hate speech, actually, because it hates real speech.
I see. Like in a meta level, it's hate speech.
But I know I've heard about it, and I'm aware of it. But I guess as a woman, it seems to me the emphasis that women should have is on correcting themselves and lifting up women. I don't think the "you go girl" thing has been a good message.
Right. But that's one of the issues that you and I take with Catholic feminism, is that it tries to explain one without enough reference to the other.
Absolutely.
And that may be the strengths or the weaknesses or the depth, the challenges that are being faced. You really can't speak about one without reference to the other. And there's that great, I wish I could remember what the name of the document is, but that great Ratzinger document where he makes a point of that. Yeah. Do you remember what I'm referring to?
On the collaboration of men and women. And he said,
yeah, I cited this in the third part of my article on Catholic feminism.
Feminism exaggerates the conflict. It exaggerates the conflict. And it's definitionally one-sided, whatever wave it is. Feminism is definitionally one-sided. It's an ism. And it's necessarily going to paint women as victims and as men as perpetrators of the crime.
And I drew a contrast in my article to this new program in Catholic women's and gender studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, which is entirely female staffed, at least at the time. And this other new program, which the name of it I forget, but it's at Steubenville, and it's for studying men and women together. And that's rather important.
That's
and especially St. Paul said it might even work more in one direction than the other, because St. Paul did say, like, the man was not made for the woman, but the woman for the man. So it might be even more true that you can't understand woman without reference to man.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, that's another conversation. But I mean, yeah, I'm for man and womanism. How about that? Man and womanism.
Right. Margaret, is there anything you want to plug before we go away?
Well, I'd love to plug the journal I'm the editor of, and it's Humanum Review. It's about the human, what makes us human, and what keeps us human. So it's the journal of the John Paul II Institute. It's beautiful. It's slow journalism, one article a week. The issues are bound together over time. There's a lot of thought that goes into issues. There are sort of annual themes. This year's theme is power, by the way, and next year's theme will be order. And,
nice.
And we they're very general themes, and then we're all the articles are usually written with an eye to what's going on now, but kind of with a longer view.
Great. Okay, so the Humanum Review, I'll link to that.
Thank you.
I'll link to your essay. I'll link to I'll link to mine. I'll link to some of the other ones we mentioned by other people. But Margaret, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was great.
Thank you, Thomas. It's a pleasure.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.